Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on this Criminal Code Amendment War Crimes Bill 2016, and I'd particularly like to commend the contribution by the member for Eden Monaro, also the member for Isaacs, but the member for Eden Monaro not only being on the committee, Joint Committee on Security and Intelligence that has looked at this piece of legislation, but in his previous life in the ADF as a colonel, internationally recognised expert on international humanitarian law, someone who has been in conflict zones, who's had to make and advise people about rules of engagement. When the member for Eden Monaro speaks on this topic, he is heard around the world by people that respect his analysis. So I thank them for their contributions, but also point out, obviously, Deputy Speaker, that this is a bipartisan approach to this piece of legislation, as is so often the case when it comes to defence matters. It is the role of Parliament to make sure that all of our federal laws are fit for purpose, that they address the mischief intended to be addressed, and that there are no unintended consequences when it comes to legislation passed by the Commonwealth Parliament. This bill addresses an anomaly in the war crimes offences so that it will target only the mischief intended and cures a potential unintended consequence. Sadly, the current law has not kept up with the nature of global conflicts. Sadly, our defence personnel are engaged in a different set of circumstances to those from 100 years ago, where people dug trenches and knew where the enemy was. There is an area of law that deals with this, like a state law or industrial law that I used to practice in. There is basically laws that deal with warfare or international humanitarian law. Obviously, a law that simultaneously permits and regulates the use of force might sound bizarre to some people listening tonight, but military necessity and the principle of proportionality are designed to balance the existence of armed hostilities with consideration of humanity. The Red Cross does a lot of work in this area, Deputy Speaker, obviously formed out of a conflict witnessed right when the Red Cross was first formed, the realisation that people were dying after a war for no good reason. And since then the Red Cross has done a lot of great work, and I'm one of the parliamentary friends of the Red Cross. And I particularly point out, Deputy Speaker, the International Humanitarian Law magazine put out by the Australian Red Cross, this one in particular on the pen and sword journalism and international humanitarian law. I'd recommend to the journalists in Parliament House. It raises some interesting questions. International humanitarian law distinguishes between conflict between the armed forces of states, traditional warfare, you might almost say, and conflicts in which one or more of the combatants are non-governmental. It also distinguishes between organised armed groups and civilians. This bill will ensure that Australia's domestic criminal laws with respect to war crimes are in line with the requirements of international humanitarian law. Our defence personnel have been restricted in their operations overseas against non-government groups such as Daesh. Australia's allies operating under international humanitarian law have been able to operate freely against these Daesh targets. So this bill before the chamber will address this anomaly by excluding from our domestic war crimes legislation criminal liability when organised armed groups are targeted by our defence forces. It will ensure that organised armed groups do not benefit from the protections that are actually afforded to civilians. This will bring our domestic war crimes legislation in line with international humanitarian law derived from the Geneva Conventions and the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions. And could I particularly mention, Deputy Speaker, former Labor Minister Robert Tickner, who's actually, my understanding, over in Geneva at the moment, doing great work for the Red Cross. Obviously, the Red Cross always neutral and has always received bipartisan support in this parliament. So the legislation before the House has reasonable objectives to ensure that our defence personnel are protected. We are lucky, very lucky in this country. For most of us, if we see an army vehicle driving down our streets, we're proud. If we see a RAF plane, we're proud. If we see a naval vessel in our day-to-day life. We're proud to see that. Our ADF make us proud, not nervous. That's not the case in all other 200 countries around the world, Deputy Speaker. And I particularly mention, Deputy Speaker, because I know of your connection with my hometown of St George, that there's the ADF, ADFA have actually been undertaking some graduate training out there in St George, where they had it like a hostage situation. And I was talking to friends from St George that were staying with me last week, and they said it was the best thing for the town. Incredible, all these army vehicles, and they had people, people had to play terrorists, and people had to play victims, and also a great boost for the town's economy, but also a great boost for, I think hopefully they'll be recruiting some ADF personnel out of St George in the next little while, because they were very impressed with the young men and women of ADFA, who are some of our nation's brightest, and the way they carried themselves in my hometown of St George. So well done to those ADFA people who I think will be graduating soon. Obviously, when we see our ADF personnel, our reaction is that we're proud of them, always are. And I'd say hello to those people from our Defence Forces that are in Parliament this week as part of the Parliamentary Placement Program. Hopefully they're still keen to serve, to be associated with the Parliament after seeing it up close. I think sometimes democracy, when you see it up close, it might be like watching how you make a sausage, Deputy Speaker, and it might be tasty, but we don't want to look too closely at it, and I say that as the son of a butcher. Nevertheless, we must remember that the important and dangerous work that our ADF personnel do, both here and all in the far-flung corners of the world. We should never be complacent about their service, and never be complacent about our Defence Forces. We need to look after them while they're serving, and I'd also like to mention the legal officers that do much of that work. I've had some connections with them, Deputy Speaker, upon the encouragement of the member for Eden Monaro, who pointed out the great work that they do, and it's a way to keep your sort of lawyers' shingle ticking over in a way. But the part of modern warfare is to be able to understand the laws of engagement. It's not like 100 years ago on the Somme, where you were in a trench and you knew where the enemy was. Now you might be making life and death decisions about something while sitting in Kansas looking at the image provided by a drone, and you're making decisions about civilians, making decisions about people that are not state entities, that they're rather groups that are pretending or using human shields. So very difficult legal decisions and legal advice needs to be given to the commanding officers. The modern commanding officer would have a very close relationship with their legal officer. So we need to look after them when they're serving, make sure they get the right equipment and the right advice and the right training. But also, Deputy Speaker, as you well know, we need to look after our service personnel when they return to our shores. And I mentioned our Returned Services League and those other veterans groups like Soldier On and Legacy and the Vietnam Vets Association and many others that do a wonderful job of supporting both current and ex-serving members of the Australian Defence Force and their families. In my electorate of Moreton, there are 5 RSL clubs, the Sherwood Indooroopilly, Salisbury, Stevens, Sunnybank and Yeronga Dutton Park, all doing great work. I've spent quite a bit of time with these clubs over the years as a Member of Parliament. I've worked closely with them in terms of some of the 100th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings commemoration process. Obviously the RSL, as we all know, has a very proud tradition. It is one of our oldest national organisations, founded in 1916, so in its second 100 years of service to the people of Australia. As well as supporting and serving our ex-servicemen and women, the RSL promotes a secure, stable and progressive Australia. We're indebted to them for the services that they provide. And the orientation of Parliament House is towards the War Memorial, no doubt, so that all members of Parliament, MPs and senators, are aware of the sacrifice of those that have come before. 2 weeks ago, we commemorated Remembrance Day in Moreton and around Australia. On the 11th November 1918, the guns of the Western Front fell silent after more than 4 years of horrific, continuous warfare. It's obviously an important day when all Australians of all races and creeds remember those that have given their lives for freedom. That horrible sacrifice of 60,000 years or 60,000 Australian soldiers, and then the numerous, too many to count, damage done after that war. The people who did return, the people who'd lost limbs, and horrific suffering for many families, not just those who lost ones, but people who returned as well. Deputy Speaker, I also attended a special ceremony here at Parliament House with the Veterans Affairs Minister, where we commemorated those that haven't died in battle, but those that have died after returning. It was a very moving ceremony, and I'm sure the Minister would agree. It was quite moving to place a poppy in a cross to commemorate those that have taken their own lives, sadly, upon returning. And I know the Minister is doing some good work in that area to look after those who return. Modern warfare takes its toll not only physically on our defence personnel, but also emotionally and psychologically. As I said, you could be making a decision thousands of miles from where someone might die, but it still will take a toll on our ADF personnel and contractors and all sorts of people associated with modern warfare. Some of those returning sadly never recover, and some find it impossible to go on. We remembered at the ceremony here in Parliament House those men and women who could not find the will to go on, who were tormented by the horrors that they had seen fighting for our freedom, for our Australian way of life. It is important to do all we can to protect the men and women of Australia's Defence Forces, both while they're fighting abroad and when they return. So this bill will help protect our brave men and women who are fighting abroad on our behalf in conflicts that sometimes have no boundaries and against an enemy who's difficult to identify and will sadly do anything, will not respect international humanitarian law. So I thank our ADF personnel for their service and commend this legislation to the House.